Good afternoon and welcome to today's Lunch with NAIOP webinar. Before we begin today, our NAIOP Vancouver President, Jason Kiselbach, will say a few words.
Thanks a lot, Paul, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're pleased to welcome you to the 7th and last of our Lunch with NAIOP webinars. We've been very happy with the response to this series, and thank you all for your participation over the past 2 months. It's always important to take a moment to thank our Platinum, Gold, and Patron sponsors. It's through the support and dedication of our sponsors that we can provide important and timely resources to the local commercial real estate community. A big thank you to all our 2020 sponsors. To stay up to date with NAIOP Vancouver, please follow us on social media. There are many national and local resources available through NAIOP, so please connect with us on there and through our website. Let's get started now with what is going to be a very interesting half hour. Vancouver is home to Canada's largest port, and the Port of Vancouver includes more than 16,000 hectares of water, more than 1,500 hectares of land, hundreds of kilometers of shoreline, and borders 16 municipalities. Our speakers today are both from the Port of Vancouver, Katherine Bamford, Director of Trade Development, and Tom Corsie, Vice President of Real Estate. Tom and Katherine will give us an overview of the port's role as the largest landlord of industrial real estate in the Lower Mainland and discuss trends they are seeing that pertain to real estate and support for the region's economic recovery. If you have questions for Katherine and Tom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'm happy now to turn our session over to our guest speakers.
Thank you, Jason, very much. And good afternoon, everyone. And we want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to be with you here today. As mentioned, my name is Tom Corsie. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate at the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. And as Jason mentioned, I'm joined with my longtime colleague, Katherine Bamford, who is our Director of Trade Development. And she'll be obviously helping me with part of today's presentation. Next slide. Now, what we thought we would do for you today is tell you a little bit about who we are, and how the work we do enables economic prosperity, not only in the Vancouver region, but across the entire country. We thought we would start with a brief overview of the Port Authority and the port itself, kind of a Port 101. Then we'll take you through a few areas of focus, real estate, infrastructure projects, and trade development. And that's the point where I'll turn the presentation over to Katherine. We'll also take some time to discuss the impact that COVID-19 has had on Canada's largest port and how the work that we will share with you will play what we think is an important role in helping our region actually recover. And then hopefully there'll be some time for your questions. So just a bit about the Port Authority and the Port of Vancouver, which are kind of two separate things. Next slide. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is an arm's length federal agency that stewards the lands and waters of the Port of Vancouver. So maybe look for the next slide. We're mandated to facilitate Canada's trade objectives, ensuring goods are moved safely while protecting the environment and, of course, considering the impact on local communities. We work for the benefit of all Canadians, and as part of our role, we lease out lands to terminal operators who move the cargo through the port. Our revenues do come from tenant rents and port user fees. And interesting to me, we don't receive any tax dollars, which is unlike many ports around the world, particularly in the US. We do lead infrastructure projects to support trade growth. We serve as the permitting authority for terminal expansions and other projects on port lands. We do run a suite of environmental programs. We do work closely with local communities to, again, minimize any impacts of port activity, typically things like congestion, emission, noise, a lot of noise complaints. We do engage with Indigenous groups. We do collaborate with other agencies on port safety and security. And we do hold the duty of the Crown to consult with Indigenous groups and to accommodate if port projects have the potential to impact Aboriginal or treaty rights. Next slide. Now, turning to the port itself, the Port of Vancouver is Canada's largest port. It's actually larger than the next 5 Canadian ports combined, if you based on the volume of cargoes that we handle. It does support about 115,000 port and supply chain jobs right across Canada. And about 170 countries trade through the Port of Vancouver. Next slide. Now, a few years ago, the Port Authority sat down with Port of Vancouver customers and stakeholders, and together we set a vision to be the world's most sustainable port. And we define a sustainable port as one that delivers economic prosperity through trade, maintains a healthy environment, and enables thriving communities. So our definition. At the Port Authority, we approach all our work through these three, what I'll call sustainability pillars. Next slide. Under our financial model as a Port Authority, we're a non-share corporation and we're required to be financially self-sufficient. As I mentioned, our revenues come from port terminals and tenants who lease port lands, and from port user fees who pay us various fees such as harbor dues. Now, besides our operating expenses, we're also required to pay an annual stipend to the federal government, kind of like an income tax. And as well, we pay payments in lieu of property taxes to local municipalities for the vacant lands that we steward. Now, we're then required to invest our remaining revenues back into the port through infrastructure investments. Our focus is on optimizing the use of existing facilities, building new infrastructure where needed to meet growing demand, improving rail and trucking corridors in particular, and constructing marine habitat to offset the impacts of port development. And we often find ourselves leading the development of common use infrastructure, both on and off port land, while port tenants would typically lead the terminal improvements they're interested in making. And those projects can range from overpasses and large-scale terminal reconfigurations to actually minor upgrades to existing facilities. At the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority in recent years, we've invested about $80 million annually into Port of Vancouver infrastructure. Next slide. The Port of Vancouver has a large and what I'll call complex jurisdiction, which you can see here in this graphic. The red lines on this map show the shoreline that we oversee, and the kind of darker turquoise area is our water or navigation jurisdiction. The port does border 16 municipalities, whereas many ports in the world would typically operate in just one municipality. The jurisdiction also intersects the traditional territories and treaty lands of several Coast Salish First Nations. So we operate in a very complex environment with many organizations in what I'll call the port ecosystem, and where port activity touches a large number of local communities. Next slide. So it's our job to carefully balance multiple priorities and interests across our jurisdiction. And part of this responsibility means managing, again, on the behalf of all Canadians and in support of national trade, the federal lands and waters that make up the port. And this would include new industrial lands that we acquire for port-related trade-enabling purposes. The Port Authority's land use plan, just in the process of updating this, guides the long-term development of these lands by helping to coordinate the use of that land and explaining the types of activities that can actually occur on those lands. Next slide. So with that foundation kind of in mind, we'll move on now to how the Port Authority manages real estate within our jurisdiction. Next slide. Now, essentially, as I mentioned, we lease out port lands and waters to companies that operate marine terminals and ship cargo through the port. Besides their day-to-day operations, terminal operators like us tend to plan for the future. And based on their business needs and forecasts, they would typically come to us with their plans for developing or enhancing their terminals and land. And when that happens, the Port Authority is the regulator for those projects. Now, we collect about $160 million annually in rent and the properties that we manage, and that equates to about 60% of total port revenue, fees being the other component mostly. We are, I believe, the largest landlord of industrial real estate in the Lower Mainland, with a total portfolio of about 3,700 acres. Approximately 2,800 acres of that is leased. And the submerged land part of the portfolio is about 13,000 acres. Someone mentioned that. And of that, there's about 3,300 acres are actually leased. We manage about 1,400 property agreements and tend to be in negotiations with around 400 of those agreements each year. And we would typically perform around 70 rent reviews each year. Next slide. Now, our property portfolio is very diverse with a broad range of tenant types, kind of everything from log storage to high-tech warehouses to intensely used terminals, and all the way through to vacant land that we're preparing for development. Other uses in the portfolio include things like barge moorage, warehousing, marine support services, commercial marinas, utilities, parks, even recreational docks. And to give you a sense of what this kind of activity can look like, I'd like to quickly show you just a couple of examples. So next slide. The first example is an acquisition of a site on River Road in North Richmond. The vendor, many of you may be aware, was PCI Developments. And the existing use is a 223,000 square foot warehousing comprising 2 buildings and 6 units. What we have in mind here is a larger consolidation with neighboring properties. Go to the next slide. This is the Richmond Logistics Hub, and of course it's located at the south foot of number 8 Road in East Richmond. And I think it's a really good example of an off-dock logistics development on Port Authority property. Now, our total ownership here, if you include some agricultural land that we do own, is about 900 acres, with about 400 acres already developed, with over 3 million square feet of logistics warehousing facilities that are currently owned by our tenants. The site has what I'll call excellent intermodal connectivity with CN, who switch many of the port users there once a day. And some of the familiar names operating on the site would include HBC Logistics, IKEA, Container World, EuroAsia Terminals, and Coast 2000. Move to the next slide. And here's another example of a development. This is or a potential development. Maybe some graphics there in that slide. We'll move to the next one. Anyways, the site I wanted to show you next is 430 Canfor Avenue in Newestminster. And this is a 50-acre site that we acquired in 2009. This was just after the amalgamation of the 3 local port authorities. And what we're doing here is kind of watching, I guess, and hoping for some local road infrastructure improvements, likely from the province of BC, that could involve Highway 1. And that could enhance access to this area and hopefully create a higher demand for an off-dock logistics facility. And what we have in mind is an approximate 750,000 square foot facility that would likely be attractive to an e-commerce user. I'll go to the next slide. Now, as a last but significant point on the real estate front, and you've heard this before from us, we are an organization, I'll call it at the forefront of calling for the protection of our region's remaining industrial land. And through Metro Vancouver's own information, industrial land makes up just 4% of our regional land base, but contributes 27% of our region's jobs and 40% of GDP. And these are, from our perspective, really critical lands for the regional economy and for port operations, which is definitely our focus. But the region is expected to run out of these lands within, I don't know, 5, 10, maybe 15 years, but some point in the medium to near term. From a port perspective, we need these lands, and in particular, those that are in close proximity to major roads and railways, really for port-related distribution and logistics activity. So that's where our problem is. And that would include things like what you're seeing as an emergence in e-commerce. Now, what we're seeing, though, and we've seen over time, is that local governments have been allowing industrial lands to be converted to other non-industrial, non-trade enabling uses. And we have been talking about this issue for about a decade now. And just to let you guys know, we will continue to do so. And really for the future of the port, which we're mostly concerned about, and by extension, the regional economy. I'll move to the next slide. Now, finally, let's take a look at what trade looks like through the Port of Vancouver, including the impact of global COVID-19, that pandemic, and how we've, I think, risen to the challenge. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Katherine.
Thanks, Tom. Welcome, everyone. I'm kind of excited to talk to you a little bit about trade through the port. If we think about Canada as a trading nation, that sort of the responsibility falls to the Port Authority system. You can just pop back up to the previous slide if you wanted to. It falls to the Port Authority system to advance that international trade agenda for Canada. So if we look at or listen to Tom's comments, we kind of boil it down a little bit. There's kind of two things we do at the Port Authority in sort of in a big picture. We move cargo and passengers, in a safe, efficient, environmentally sensitive way. And then we build or enable the building of infrastructure in order to move those cargo and passengers. It's kind of an elegant loop there. So as a trading nation, we know our prosperity is in many ways based in trade. And essentially the world, wants what Canada has. So if we go to the next slide, we can see what that actually, looks like. So what the world wants is what Canada has. So that looks like these types of commodities. So as the most diversified port in North America, we have a very diverse cargo mix. This keeps us really resilient in times of challenge like we're going through at the moment. But I think, one of the things that we need to look at is, what is that going to look like over time, and what does that look like sort of in the future? So if we take these 5 sort of groups and go to the next slide, this kind of shows us where we are from a historical performance perspective, but also that shaded area is our forecast. Now, if you think about what Tom has said about trade enabling lands and the challenge we're seeing in the Lower Mainland, what you see here, there's a couple of stories you can pull out of this graph. Number one is trade continues to grow. We can see exactly how it's growing as we monitor that performance. We also project what it might look like in the future. And as I said, that's that shaded area. Those are the forecasts. Interestingly, we'll get into what 2020 might look like at the end of the discussion here. But a couple of things to point out. That big blue slug there is bulk. Bulk commodities are largely export. Exports what often keeps, what keeps the country resilient. The country's prosperous for what we sell, not what we buy. The red section there are containers. It's about 20% of our total volume, whereas bulk is about 65% of our total volume. The orange there is break bulk. Things like lumber and pulp and import steel and project cargo. So when you look at the mix there, you can see that we're kind of growing in almost every sector, driven by large-scale growth in the bulk commodities, grain, coal, potash, liquid bulk, and also on the container side. So this is the demand side of the equation. So the supply side of the equation is where we get into building infrastructure. So we have sort of a 3-pronged infrastructure strategy where we're building on-terminal infrastructure or enabling the building of it, as Tom mentioned. We're talking about building, transportation infrastructure. If you think about the port as a big, shopping mall, the Port Authority kind of operates the mall, and the terminals are the equivalent to the stores in the mall. So if you think about, we need to kind of expand the mall to be able to handle all of the demand that's coming at us through these commodities. And then the third piece of the sort of infrastructure equation is really digital infrastructure. So I'm going to talk very briefly about those 3 pieces today. So if you go to the next slide, we're seeing, as I said, demand we're seeing demand for terminal capacity in almost every sector. So our strategy for building terminal infrastructure is what you would expect. We want to densify potentially existing facilities. we want to expand existing facilities, or we have the option to build brand new. That's a challenging option in today's conditions. So we want to really work on densifying and expanding as much as we can. So in the container sector, I'm not going to go into every sector because we don't have the time, but in the container sector, as an example, Canada's West Coast ports, as we know, are forecast to run out of container and terminal capacity by around the mid-2020s, which is kind of just around the corner. So for us, it's very, very important to provide terminal capacity or enable the building of terminal capacity to handle that demand. So we've got two projects. Just going to highlight very briefly. Centrum in the Inner Harbor. For those of you who are familiar with Burrard Inlet, you'll recognize Centrum, foundational terminal for us. There's a project going on right now where the footprint of the terminal is going to be built out by about 15%. But because of the densification and reconfiguration of that terminal, we'll be able to, together with the terminal operator, achieve about a 60% increase in container handling capacity. So that strategy for densifying and expanding a little bit, that's the strategy for Centrum. For Roberts Bank Terminal 2, this is a brand new terminal that we are proposing in South Delta, where actually I live and I'm talking to you from today. It's called Roberts Bank Terminal 2. We've been working on this proposal for many years. It's gone through a very, very robust and comprehensive environmental assessment. And this would, if approved and if all of the permits are put in place and subject to final investment decision by a potential concessionaire, this terminal would probably, we're expecting it to be operational by the late 2020s. So you can see as the Port Authority, as we're trying to match that demand with supply, it sometimes gets a little crunchy from a timing perspective for us to be able to provide that supply to match that demand. So if we go to the next slide, the second sort of pillar, I guess, of infrastructure development that we're involved in is enabling or building or enabling the collaborative investment for off-terminal infrastructure. So if you think about it as a mall, not only are you trying to densify the mall and make sure that the capacity is there inside the mall through terminal capacity, you actually want the goods movement to get to and from the mall. So this is sort of this regional transportation strategy that has benefits for enabling international trade, but also has benefits for supporting communities. This is an example of, say, overpasses that we have been involved in building over the last 10, 15 years. It's a good example of how you can increase the fluidity of conflicting supply chain pieces. You got trucks and traffic on the road. If you are having those at grade, it's a bit of a challenge. As you separate the grade and you've got road and rail operating independently from each other, that actually increases the goods movement fluidity and capacity of the entire system while providing substantial benefits to communities. So Canada is, I travel around the world and we hear from all over the world, Canada is very good at this type of a strategy of increasing transportation capacity through this type of grade separation. So if we go to the next slide, it just gives you a sense of some of these, again, if you're familiar with the Lower Mainland. Between 2009, 2015, we provided, we were either building or enabling the building of, through collaborative infrastructure investment, 17 separate projects. We're undergoing another, I would say, tranche of between 17 and 20 projects either contemplated or underway in the Lower Mainland, in that big port jurisdiction that Tom was referencing earlier. This has substantial benefits for communities and helps us move cargo and passengers. So we go to the next slide. The third sort of digital, the third infrastructure piece is really digital infrastructure. You can imagine that spending all of that money, all of that time building infrastructure, hard infrastructure, we can actually leverage the value and the investment of that infrastructure by seeing into the system. So we say that visibility is what we see, but transparency is what we share. And we're a leader in transparency initiatives, not just for operational excellence and performance, but imagine an example being every container truck we have in the gateway. There's around 1,700 container trucks that operate in the gateway. They each have a GPS unit on board. So for instance, that unit transmits not just information about performance and cargo flow, but it actually helps us not just report to our port users the health of the gateway in that particular sector. You can actually determine over time where to build or propose the next overpass or the next road, because you can track how that supply chain is working. So these types of examples, and we actually have an app where we can show all of this information that our port users can use to make operational decisions. So digital infrastructure, very, very important to leveraging the value of the infrastructure investment in the hard infrastructure. And then finally, for me, what are the trade impacts so far this year? Let's move to the next slide. And this is interesting. So you would think that COVID would have had a very spectacular impact. And in a couple of sectors, it absolutely has. Now, this title of this slide was contemplated to be, what are the COVID-related impacts so far this year? But we've had a couple of other impacts. You can remember in January and February, there was weather issues for the entire system in Canada. Also in February, we had protests that were prolonged that impacted the supply chain fluidity across the country. And then starting in March, we started to feel a little bit of what that COVID effect might be. So interestingly, with all of that, April year-to-date stats show our total cargo actually up 1% overall. So if you think back to that graph and the cargo mix, that explains a lot of what we're seeing. If you remember, 2018 was a record year for the port in that graph, and last year, 2019, was the second best performance we had after 2018. So we're coming off two essentially record years or near record years, and here we are in the middle of considerable disruption halfway through the year, and looking at our stats, we're kind of staying pretty resilient. That goes back to that cargo mix, that diversified cargo mix. If we look at bulk, it's largely export, and it's led by grain, several record years in a row, and grain's looking very strong this year, and coal up 4%. On the container side, it's down a little bit for sure. And interestingly, in January, this was down 18%. And I've seen the preliminary May numbers, and they're a little better than -11. So what we're seeing is a gradual increase back to what we would consider to be a normal level for containers. Automobiles, absolutely no question, are seeing an effect specifically of COVID. I'm pretty sure none of you all have been walking around kicking tires, neither is kind of anyone else. So we're going to see an effect on our automobile business. Cruise, of course, everyone is well aware that we do not have a cruise season at all this year. So those are some of the effects that we've seen. Interestingly, if you think back to that graph, that shaded forecast area may change overall, definitely for cruise and certainly for automobiles. But if you think of the majority of those impacts, we may actually come out okay in 2020 based on the strength of the Canadian exports. Canadian exports are up actually 2% overall. While imports are down a little bit. Being largely an export port, this puts us in a very, very good position through our infrastructure investments and collaborative infrastructure financing and investments to actually have a positive effect on the nation as we emerge from this pandemic situation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tom to finish off.
So thanks very much, Katherine. We'll go to the next slide. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I know we're out of time, but how the pandemic is actually impacting the Port Authority office and our employees. So what we did in early March is we set up an internal task force to kind of help guide the Port Authority's response to COVID-19, both internally and really across the port. And that included Port Authority staff working remotely since mid-March. We've got over 300 people doing that. New health and safety protocols at our facilities, We've ensured continuity of marine operations, really to support Canada's trade, the trade that Katherine was talking about. We've advanced an economic support strategy for port tenants and customers. Our COVID-19 responses included ensuring COVID-19 health and safety measures are implemented in infrastructure projects even by our contractors, and we have a lot of those going on throughout the region. Supporting terminals and tenants experiencing COVID-19 challenges, including running a fast-track project environmental review process for for tenants who wanted to improve their kind of safety projects, like the need to expand portables and things like that. We also supported the trucking sector, actually rented a bunch of washrooms from the moving industry and had a free lunch program operating for a number of weeks. And we would observe that all port businesses are also taking steps to respond to COVID-19, and most notably with regard to the health and safety of their employees. So go to the very last slide. And what I thought I'd do is try and pull all this together. We've looked at how the Port Authority manages land and supports infrastructure development, and as well as how trade is responding to COVID-19. Now, though the Port of Vancouver has not been immune to the impacts of COVID-19, as Katherine was highlighting, our preemptive work, we think, in forecasting resiliency has allowed us to, at the Port of Vancouver and at the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, to weather this storm, pretty well. We know from previous downturns, not that we haven't experienced these before, that trade does rebound quickly. And although, kind of as Katherine was saying, we have no crystal ball, we would expect the port to recover and resume the growth trajectory that it was on previously. And I guess if I can leave one thought with you today, it's that trade and infrastructure development at the Port of Vancouver are supporting the region's COVID-19 recovery and our long-term economic strength. And thank you. I think we have actually time for a couple of pre-posted questions. Katherine kind of already answered this one, but I'll give it again, which is, given the trade disputes between the US and China, what are the long-term prospects for the export of commodities through the Port of Vancouver?
Yeah, I can sort of take a stab at that. I think if we look at the statistics, we can see that the Port of Vancouver and the Canadian port system has actually been able to weather several of these geopolitical challenges as they come through, depending on the commodity, that may be boycotted or in some way reduced. There's another commodity that is going to see an increase. For instance, recently challenges with China, we saw a very sharp reduction in canola, but an increase in wheat. So I think the short answer is we've seen many of these geopolitical challenges in the past, and because of the diversity of the cargo mix at the Port of Vancouver, what we're seeing is that resiliency being built into the system. One goes up, one goes down, and we kind of see that seesawing over time.
Thank you, Katherine. I think we have one last question, and the question is, any evidence of shift from just-in-time delivery for inbound products? And we do see the supply chain tightening a little bit, and we see that over time. Sometimes it's tight, sometimes it's a bit loose. I think the one trend we're seeing kind of in this area is an increased demand for e-commerce space. And I think a lot of you on the line here are probably experiencing that as well. And so this kind of goes back to our previous point about the, kind of lack of land supply in Vancouver to accommodate those uses. They tend to want larger sites, and this is becoming a problem for us. Not that e-commerce is shifting to Calgary necessarily, but we are seeing some distribution activity actually shift to what we would call the inland port of the West Coast, Calgary. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and this has been a real pleasure for us.